Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today we're continuing on with question 6 of CMI's 15 Questions for the Evolutionists series. So far, in part 1 of this video, they have decided that intuition should be sufficient to determine design because reasons. We just know, okay? Stop questioning it!
I mean, even if you don't know what the code system is communicating, you know, like when they found the Rosetta Stone, you know, they had this language and they couldn't interpret it, right?
Hieroglyphics, but then you have a translation device.
That's right, and then they could figure out what the language is. But they knew it was a language even before they knew what it was saying.
Do you guys not know the basics of the Rosetta Stone? Its whole thing was that it was a proclamation that was sent out in multiple written languages, 2 of which we had not yet deciphered prior to the finding of the Rosetta Stone, Egyptian hieroglyphics and Egyptian demotics. The third language on the stone was Ancient Greek, which we already had a decent handle on when it was discovered. Since it said the same thing multiple times in 3 languages, we were able to use our ability to translate the Greek version as a kind of key toward translating the 2 Egyptian scripts. So it's not like we just found a rock with random scribblings on it and had to figure out that these random scribblings were not actually random, but an intelligently designed language, and then were able to translate it. It's that we already knew one of the languages that was on it, and had examples of the other 2 languages that were already known, and could use the language on the stone that we did know as a method of figuring out how to translate the languages that we didn't know.
Recognize the design that's there, the intelligence that's behind it.
That's right, and
you have the SETI program as well. I mean, if we're
the search for extraterrestrial intelligence.
Extraterrestrial intelligence, yes.
Right.
Ah yes, SETI. Do you actually know what SETI is doing, or are you just assuming that they're looking for something that piques their intuitions? At SETI, they are specifically looking for narrow-band signals, signals that are high energy but only exist in a tight band of the electromagnetic spectrum. Naturally occurring phenomena do not seem to send out signals this narrow, though certainly if we were to find such a signal, the first conclusion would not be that it is intelligence, but rather that it is some yet unknown natural phenomenon. But how we would determine if it were not a natural phenomenon would be to observe the signal for modulation. If modulation occurs in a meaningful pattern, then that would strengthen, though not solidify, the case that the signal is coming from a being rather than a natural phenomenon. And this is even assuming that we would be capable of recognizing the signal. Perhaps a being that has an entirely different evolutionary history than us wouldn't even think to send the kinds of signals that we would interpret as intelligence. There is no guarantee that their thought processes would mimic our own. In fact, that's one of the chief criticisms of SETI, the fact that they operate on the assumption that we would be able to recognize a signal that was designed by beings that might have a completely different concept of what constitutes design than us. In other words, we are searching for signals that look like they were designed by beings who would categorize design the same way as we do, but it is entirely possible that we are missing out on signals that really were designed because we are incapable of recognizing them as such.
And folks there involved with that program, they're looking for complex coded signals that are not going to occur naturally. That implies that we can tell the difference between something that would be natural and something that would be intelligently designed.
Exactly. It is entirely possible that SETI is looking on the wrong bands of the EM spectrum, they're looking for the wrong patterns in the signals, or they've made some other critical mistake in figuring out if a signal is actually coming from extraterrestrial beings rather than being naturally occurring. They are looking for the kinds of signals that we humans might think to send out to a planet if we found life there that was more primitive than us, and we wanted to communicate with them. But there is no guarantee that other life in the universe would have the same ideas as us about the best way to go about this, and so we may be entirely incapable of detecting design in a signal that is actually designed from an alien source. So until we have examples of alien design, we don't actually know what it would look like, and cannot rely on our intuitions to tell us what they should look like.
Right.
That would come from intelligence.
For example, a coded language system, if we're listening for it, right? Because we want to hear signals from the aliens that are out there.
That's the idea.
Like that. Yep. Right.
And this is where some basic logic comes in. If these hypothetical beings were to think somewhat similar to us, they wouldn't start with language. And in this instance, it wouldn't be language as in a recording of a voice speaking a language, but something more akin to Morse code, with information carried in pulses. But the thing about information is that it's not information unless it can be understood as such. So the best way to establish contact, to establish the fact that it is not a random signal, would be to send some sort of information that is universal. Mathematical concepts, like the Fibonacci sequence, have been suggested. The Fibonacci sequence is a series of numbers where the next number in the series is the sum of the two previous numbers, starting at 0. So 0, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34, and so on. This works not because mathematics are obviously designed, but because the signal would then contain information that it is possible to interpret without already having a mutual understanding with whoever sent it. But even then, being possible to interpret does not guarantee that the receiver would actually understand it as a designed message of any kind, and it is possible, though highly unlikely, that SETI has received several such messages but were looking at them in the wrong way, and so have discarded them as background noise.
If we could know that we could tell if it was intelligently designed, a code system, a language system, if it came from outer space, and then we look down our microscopes and we see DNA, which is an extremely complicated coded language system.
DNA is not a coded language system. It is roughly analogous to code. We can think of it as a code as a mental shortcut to figuring out how it works, but it is most definitely not actually a code. It is a chemical. It's a chemical whose reactions result in the building of proteins, but it is still just a chemical, and all it does is react according to the laws of physics and chemistry.
Why would you say that that's naturalistic, but if it came from outer space, it wasn't naturalistic?
Because there isn't a message in DNA? There isn't any sort of pattern that seems to be meant to tell us anything in particular. And to reiterate, we don't actually know at this point if we would be able to recognize a signal received by SETI as designed, so this is a really bad comparison on your part.
Doesn't make sense.
It doesn't. Okay, answer number 2. If there were a designer, we should see designs tending towards simplicity, not complexity. Yet that is the opposite of what we see.
This is true as well. Simplicity is a hallmark of good design. A design should only be as complex as is absolutely necessary to carry out a task. Having 26 bones in a complex arrangement in our feet is unnecessarily complex. We really only need 2 to 3 bones for what our feet are used for. The 26 bones are an evolutionary leftover from when our more arboreal ancestors needed more flexible feet to help grab tree branches. And this excess of complexity in our feet can lead to several chronic foot problems over the course of our lives. And so, if it is designed, it's a bad design.
We need to make a point here, folks. The answers that we're listing here that have come in from skeptics, from evolutionists about these questions, we're not cherry picking them. We're not making them up. We're not just answering certain ones and not answering others. If you have a better answer to some of these questions, please email them in and we'll respond to them. This is an actual, I mean, I wanted to point that out because...
Do we need to answer this? Or is this...
Would you use that argument if you were talking about a computer?
Okay, are they even going to attempt to answer that? Like, yes, I would use that argument when talking about a computer. Computers are kept as simple as they need to be in order to complete their tasks. Sure, you could design a computer that has the central processing unit decentralized and split into its components scattered all over the motherboard. That would be more complex than having them all in one place, but that would not be a better design. But it's worse than that. Going back to the example of our feet, there are a whole bunch of unnecessary moving parts there. Analogizing that to a computer would be like having a segmented computer chassis putting all of the computing components in one segment, while having all the fans in a separate segment trying to blow air through a small ventilation hole. If we allow one fan directly on the CPU, it's possible that such a setup will technically work, but you'd be wasting a lot of resources powering all the fans in a separate chamber, and you'd be likely to run into thermal throttling going on in the main chamber. A simpler design of just having 1 or 2 fans in the main chamber and scrapping all the extras would work just as well, if not better. So, well, no, just being simple does not automatically make something designed. It is ultimately a measure of how simple or complex the thing is relative to whatever task it was designed to perform that can show us whether or not something has the appearance of design. If there is needless complexity, like the extra foot bones or the defunct gene for vitamin C, then that is indicative of bad design or no design.
You know, this computer is way more sophisticated than that computer. So the less sophisticated one was designed, but the more sophisticated one wasn't designed.
How are you defining sophisticated? How do you measure sophistication? What about complexity? And complex from whose perspective? Here's an example from my life that might help you out a bit with this one. I once worked in the valet department of a hotel. In this department, they had set up a system where your ticket number would be displayed on the screen in the lobby, and then you would take your ticket to the valet desk and exchange it with your car keys. The system was designed by the hotel's accountant, who made the whole thing in Excel. It was really weird and complicated. He made Excel do things that Excel was not supposed to do. As a result, any time the numbers updated, there would be a big glitchy flash happening on the display screens, which were set up as a secondary monitor with one spreadsheet stretched from the laptop's main screen across to the display screens, which led to all sorts of problems. It would regularly crash, and the guests could all see you troubleshooting everything as it popped up on the second monitor. So I designed a simple browser program that was more efficient and looked much better to the guests, and it was a lot simpler than the spreadsheet. One browser window would open on the display screens, and a separate one would open on the laptop. If the program crashed for any reason, the display screen instance of the browser just populated when the instance on the laptop screen told it to update, so if it crashed, you could just restart the instance on the laptop screen, and that would fix the issue without the guests seeing anything at all. But the problem was that this was more complex from the operator's perspective. For the spreadsheet, all you had to do was open it and resize the window, and you're ready to go. For my program, you had to open the browsers in a specific order in order for it to work, and even if I titled the files Open Me First and Open Me Second, they didn't seem to be able to figure out which ones to open first or second. This desk was run by the valets themselves, who were mostly retirees who still needed a job, so, you know, old people and computers and all that. And on top of all of this, after opening them, you'd have to select the browser on the display screens and then press F11 to make them full screen, and then select the browser on the laptop screen. So because this setup process was slightly more difficult, hell, I even coded a line to force the browsers into opening on the correct monitors, so they didn't even have to position the windows. So it wasn't that much more difficult, but because they were slightly more complex to operate, nobody used them except for me. The code itself was simpler, the program more efficient, the display more pleasing to the guests, but the interface was a tiny bit more complex, and that killed the entire project. So, at the end of the day, simplicity does generally indicate better design, but there are different ways of measuring this.
It doesn't really fly.
It's kind of nonsensical here.
No, it's really not. You're just not understanding the argument.
Okay. Answer number 3, vestigial organs provide evidence of evolution. These are structures which once had a purpose but no longer do.
No, that's not quite what a vestigial feature is. It doesn't have to not have a purpose. It just has to obviously have been adapted from one purpose to another, leaving the vestiges of its old purpose behind, hence vestigial. So the muscles that try to swivel your non-swiveling ears towards sounds appear to not have a function, yes, but their lack of a function is not what makes them vestigial. It's the fact that they were used by our evolutionary ancestors for a different function, to swivel their swiveling ears towards sound. But how about the appendix? That's a vestigial feature, is it not? Yet it still has a function. It serves as a refuge for your gut microbes during diseases that tend to flush them out, like diarrhea-causing diseases. Except in developed countries, this function is actually vestigial. We don't see any long-term ill effects from the removal of the appendix because pretty much everybody has access to clean water and sanitation, so we don't have the same diarrhea-causing diseases running rampant. So the appendix is an organ which we appear to be actually watching in real time becoming vestigial. Wisdom teeth are vestigial. They're leftovers from when we had larger jaws that had room for them. Whale pelvises, while still useful for attaching muscles that they use to wave their dicks around, are vestigial as they no longer serve the function of the pelvis in non-marine mammals, like the ones that they evolved from.
And this is, we've heard this many, many times over many years. Vestigial organs, there was dozens and dozens of them. For example, at the in Tennessee in 1925, at the famous Scopes trial, there was all kinds of them listed, something like 200 different vestigial organs and so on, were in the books back at that time. But how many are there today? None.
Right.
That is just flat out not true. Sure, there would have been things listed as vestigial in the early 1900s that are more well understood today, and possibly we have figured out what they do in a way that has rendered them non-vestigial, but there are still plenty of vestigial features in the human body alone. In fact, the only people who have ever defined vestigial as meaning completely useless are creationists. It has been recognized since before the term vestigial started being applied to describe these vestigial features, that these features are not necessarily useless, being described as becoming wholly or in part functionless. The in part part of that usually gets ignored by creationists.
People talk about the pituitary gland was a vestigial organ. It doesn't really have a useful function.
Or your appendix.
The appendix.
Yeah.
No, just rip it out. It doesn't really have a useful function. Well, they do have useful functions.
Right.
Pituitary gland? Yes. Appendix? Not so much in developed countries. The appendix is one that we are currently in the process of watching go from a fully functioning organ to being a vestigial feature. So it's not all the way there yet, but that seems to be where it's heading. And also, to the best of my knowledge, nobody has claimed the pituitary gland to be vestigial. Rather, there is a part of it, the intermediate zone, which is vestigial in humans. Our anterior and posterior lobes still appear to be fully functional.
And even if you could find an organ that you say, well, now is degenerate, it used to have a purpose, now it's degenerate, doesn't have a purpose, that's no argument for evolution anyway.
So you're saying that the muscles in our ears that are trying to move our ears toward sounds are somehow not evidence for evolution? It's design? The designer wanted us to have useless muscles in our heads that clearly have an evolutionary relationship to the muscles in the heads of our apparently close relatives?
This has always been a terrible argument from evolution because it fits the creationist
argument
model.
for the Bible.
Yeah, that we started in perfection and we've been degrading ever since.
So Adam and Eve were able to swivel their ears, had room in their mouths for their wisdom teeth, didn't have a ridiculous number of bones in their feet, and had spines that were better adapted to walking upright than ours? Okay, so Adam and Eve weren't human then. They must have been our common ancestor with chimps. Gotcha. Wait, aren't you supposed to be against evolution?
If you could find an organ that was on its way to becoming something, or just all of a sudden appeared or could do something that, and we never had it before, that might be an argument for evolution.
So like the development of the median artery in the arm, an artery as of yet only present in about 30% of the population? And I know you guys seem to be focusing specifically on humans, but what about the Italian wall lizards that, when 5 pairs were introduced to a new island, had the makings of a new organ within just 36 years, which allowed them to take advantage of plants as food, which were not as abundant in their native habitat? But yeah, examples of this are rather sparse. Do you know why? It's because we don't know where evolution will go from here. We don't even know what a half-done organ would look like. I mean, for all we know, our livers could develop a new primary function in the distant future which would make our descendants look at our livers and declare them only half-functional livers. But that is necessarily speculation, and since scientists try to avoid speculation, they don't paint wild pictures of where evolution will take us in the future, leaving that to the science fiction authors instead.
But to go in the other direction, it's just not
Doesn't
a
really
good
work.
No.
Okay, another answer number 4 that has come in to question 6 here. There are structures that would be, or that are, horrendously designed, but they're easy to explain if they evolved. The laryngeal nerve, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that properly, is one example of this.
Yes, the recurrent laryngeal nerve, the nerve that goes from the brain to the larynx, a trip of only a few centimeters, but detours through the aortic arch in the chest first for no discernible reason. Sure, it innervates stuff down there, but it gets there by traveling together with the vagus nerve. It could easily split off above the aorta to make a much more sensible detour, allowing the vagus nerve to do the innervating down in the chest. But no, it goes down under the arch instead. And while this detour is silly in humans and laughable in giraffes, it is just completely and utterly ridiculous in sauropod dinosaurs, which surely would also have had one as it is present in all land vertebrates.
Right.
So this is a nerve that goes, well, from your brain, obviously,
right,
and it loops around down near the heart and then comes up to your
larynx
again.
Yeah, and so there's actually many different versions of this. We've got bad back, we've got weak backs, and all these
poorly designed
eye, and all these kind of things.
Exactly. There are a lot of design flaws that need to be ignored or dismissed in order to suggest a perfect creator is responsible for our design.
Okay, well, let's look at a well-known textbook. Medical textbook, Gray's Anatomy, and see what they have to say about the laryngeal nerve. As the recurrent nerve hooks around the subclavian artery or aorta, it gives off several cardiac filaments to the deep part of the cardiac plexus. As it ascends in the neck, it gives off branches more numerous on the left than on the right side to the mucous membrane and muscular coat of the esophagus, branches to the mucous membrane and muscular fibers of the trachea, and some pharyngeal filaments to the constrictor pharyngeus inferior. Sorry, I might not have pronounced that correctly.
Yes, but if you'll kindly note the section of the book that you took this quote from, it is the section titled The Vagus Nerve. In other words, there was already a nerve going that way, but the laryngeal nerve took its weird detour anyway. There is no good reason for it to do that.
Here's the problem. Dawkins is only considering its main destination, which is the larynx.
Right.
In reality, this nerve has a role in supplying, parts of the heart, the windpipe muscles, mucous membranes, esophagus.
Everything it innervates except for the heart could be accomplished without going through the chest. The heart could easily be innervated by the vagus nerve, which was already going that way anyway. The only way this makes sense is if its path was determined in our evolutionary ancestors before the neck evolved, as it is the development of the neck in the embryo that ends up trapping it. So this nerve does a pretty decent job of pointing to the fact that we are descended from an aquatic fish-like ancestor.
Isn't this kind of like the whole vestigial organ argument that was popular years ago? Really, the vestigial organs that used to be on the list many, many years ago,
right.
It's just that we didn't know what they were for
right.
yet.
Fun fact, when talking about cosmology, there are a lot of cases where the accurate scientific answer is that we do not know. Same goes for abiogenesis. This is where creationists swoop in and stuff their god into those I don't knows, all the while complaining about the non-creationist appealing to some unknown future scientific discovery. But then bring up vestigial organs and watch how quickly those tables get spun around as the creationists appeal to future humans finally figuring out that there actually was a use for your ear-swiveling muscles. All of this despite the fact that nobody who actually has a good understanding of evolution will claim that a vestigial organ is defined as being a completely useless organ that is left over by evolution.
And even if you could point to something, you said, well, I think I could have built it better. I could have designed it better. That's still no argument that it had been designed.
No, but it is one hell of a good argument against an all-powerful, all-knowing, perfect designer that you were describing. If a lowly human can figure out a better design, then God's original design was necessarily imperfect. If you're okay with God being imperfect, well, that's fine, I guess, but something tells me that you're not.
Okay, answer number 5. There's a 5th response that came in. It's very lucky that everything works out just so that it looks like if it were designed. But if it weren't, we wouldn't be around to notice it.
Yeah, okay, that was awkwardly phrased, but that seems to be getting at the argument against the fine-tuning of the universe, where, of course, the universe that life developed in was a good fit for life to develop. Otherwise, life wouldn't have developed. What would be better evidence for God is if life ended up in a universe where life clearly could not survive, and yet it was somehow being supernaturally sustained in spite of the impossibility. They don't do a good job of responding to this one, and the video is getting long now, so I'm not going to cover it. Link to the original is down below if you really want to hear them bungle through it. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Takoja, who says, "Why would you reveal your face? I mean, then we can't imagine you as a talking rhino anymore, sad emoji." Well, it's mainly for live streams. I want to be able to have conversations with people and stuff, which is more interesting when you can actually see each other. My regular videos will still have my avatar, so if that's an issue for you, just don't watch my live streams from here on out. Also, to make it even easier, I've actually started putting out my videos as a podcast. I'm still working out the kinks of the scheduling, but it's essentially just going to be the audio from my videos. Link will be in the description, or you can search for Vice Rhino on your favorite podcast app. Except for Apple, because Apple is garbage and won't let me submit my podcast to them. It just sends me on an infinite login loop, which I'm told can be solved by using Safari, but since they don't do Safari for Windows and I don't have access to a Mac, you ecosystem folks are just SOL for this one for now. Patrons get my podcast early and ad-free too. Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, Jerry the Berry, David Schinkel, Lynn Dobbs, Mark McManus, What Jesus, and all the rest, who are the vestiges from previous versions of my channel. If you'd like to serve some weird function that you obviously weren't designed for, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. If you feel so inclined, you can also support the channel through direct donation or my Amazon wishlist, which are linked in the description, as well as my social media accounts and my P.O. Box address. See you next time.